Okay, so welcome. This is the fourth session now, and we have a couple more after tonight, and then the next week is we're off on a great adventure. But we're looking forward tonight. I'm gonna, in a little while, pick up the lecture where we left off last week. We were talking about Jerusalem, and I have quite a few more things to say about Jerusalem. But I want to begin by talking to you a little bit about preparations to make for the trip itself in terms of some of the things that you need to think about. And many people have asked me about, what should I pack? What should I bring? What kind of clothes should I plan on bringing? So as you think about that, number one is you don't need any formal attire. Some tourists to Israel have like a formal dinner that they might go to, or some meetings where you'll need formal attire, but we won't have anything like that. Just casual clothes, comfortable clothes. We will be doing a lot of walking, so make sure you have a good pair of shoes that you can walk in, that not going to hurt your feet. Loose-fitting, comfortable clothes. We will be arriving right towards the tail end of the rainy season in Israel. It's actually, once February is over and March starts, that's considered when the rainy season stops, and we're now in the dry season. So there's a possibility we may pick up a rain shower or two. So you want to bring something that you can put a hat on your head or a hood on your jacket or something you can cover up if it starts raining. It can be chilly at times, especially towards the evening, or if we get into, something where it's maybe rainy and windy combination. So you want to bring a jacket. You won't need a big heavy parka or anything like that, but a jacket you can put on if it gets cold. Some days it may be, quite warm. So the idea is to think in terms of layers, so that you can take items off, put items on. And during the day, you'll probably want to have with you something like a backpack or some kind of a bag that you can bring some stuff along with you. Most of the days we'll have spent the night in the hotel. We'll get on the bus in the morning, and then we'll go out to wherever our tour location takes us that day. And there are a couple of days in Jerusalem where we'll be on foot almost the whole day, even without the bus, just walking around Jerusalem. But most of the days we'll be on the bus from place to place. We'll drive somewhere, get off the bus, we'll walk around and tour and see things. And so you may want to have a backpack or a bag with you that you can carry some things. Maybe you want to have, put a light jacket in your bag, so then if it does start raining, you pull it out, put it on, that kind of thing. The climate in Israel is very much like it is here in Northern California, very much. It's Northern Hemisphere, so it's not the reverse of our season. It's the same as our season. So if we were going down to South America or Australia, Australia is having their summer right now, and they've been in the news because they're having a record heat wave. But in Israel, Northern Hemisphere, about the same latitude as Northern California, they're having weather a lot like ours, and the temperatures are pretty much like it is here in Northern California. So that kind of gives you an idea about what kind of things to plan on. If you are planning on walking through Hezekiah's tunnel, just remember that we'll be walking through water that day. Now the water it varies from mid-shin to mid-thigh in depth. And so what I usually do is I'll bring like a pair of shorts and an old pair of worn-out tennis shoes. And what I do is when I get done, I just toss the tennis shoes out, so I'm not carrying a wet pair of tennis shoes around with me the rest of the day. You probably don't want to go through Hezekiah's tunnel barefoot. There are little pebbles on the bottom, and you don't want to cut your foot.
Little water shoes.
Yeah, perfect. The water shoes. You get those plastic water shoes, and then they won't even soak up any water. They'll dry out right away. So something like that would be perfectly fine. Yeah. For the Hezekiah's tunnel also, you want to make sure you have a little flashlight with you. Okay? It can be a headlamp you strap your head, or it can be a flashlight you hold in your hand. Either one of those. But it is, I mean, without any artificial light, it's pitch dark in there. You're like you're back in a deep cave. So, and every year, there's usually some people that forget to bring a flashlight. We'll go through as a group, and there'll be lots of people with lights. So if you forget, it's not a huge disaster. You could even buy one over there. And let me just stop here and introduce our new tour member. So this is Clint Etherton, and glad to have you here tonight, Clint. Yeah, that's all right. I mentioned you and your daughter to the group before you arrived, and we prayed for you because we know you're trying to get your passports on time. So our prayers will be with you, and we're looking forward to this. And Clint, we were just talking about what kinds of things to pack, what to expect in terms of weather and that sort of thing. So now, here's another thing I need to mention. We will be visiting many sites that are considered holy sites. Some of them Jewish holy sites, some of them Christian holy sites, some of them Muslim holy sites. So when we are visiting holy sites, it's especially important for ladies to have their shoulders and their knees covered. So you want to make sure that you bring, modest clothing with you. Some warm days, we'll be out maybe where we're not visiting any holy sites, and you could wear shorts and a t-shirt, no problem. And the tour guide will caution you. He'll let you know the day before we go to any sites like that. But you'll want to make sure, especially ladies, that if that you have something you can cover up with. So arms and legs would be best. I would just plan on having arms and legs covered, and make sure you don't have any plunging necklines or things like that. Last time this is mostly for women, but even for men sometimes. Last time we visited the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron, and it was kind of a spur of the moment thing, last minute. And so we weren't really prepared, and a couple of guys on the tour wore shorts that day. The Tomb of the Patriarchs, even the guys can't go in wearing shorts. But they have at the entrance to the Tomb of the Patriarchs these skirts for women that women can put on. So the guys had to wear skirts. So they got lots and lots of ribbing. And they took it good naturedly. We've had a lot of fun thinking about that. But so obviously when we're up on the Temple Mount, that's a place for modest dress. Tomb of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the place for modest dress. So you just want to be ready for that. But there will be lots of days where, just like people dress here in Northern California, it's perfectly fine. And so, especially early in the tour, we will not be in a lot of those kinds of sites. Around the Sea of Galilee, there are some holy sites where there are churches. So you just want to be prepared for that. Any questions about that? Now, another question that gets asked a lot and I want to talk to you about is electricity. So you may have electrical appliances that you want to bring. Maybe you have a computer, maybe you have a shaver, maybe you have a curling iron. You want to have maybe a charger for your cell phone or something like that. Okay, so first of all, the electricity in Israel is 220 volt. Okay, 220 volt. And the plugs have 2 ground holes. Sometimes there's a third ground hole. I'm going to show the, for the sake of the, okay, what this is an adapter, okay? So on your appliance, sometimes they will say that it can take 110 through 240 volts. Okay, so here's a power supply, and this one says right on it, input AC 100 through 240. So if it says that, then this can be plugged into the 220 volt electrical system there. And all you need is an adapter like this, so the two round plugs plug into the wall, and then your prong thing here plugs into this adapter, and now you can plug it right into the electrical system. But if this does not say it can go up to 240 volts, and you do this, you'll fry your equipment. So be sure you read on your appliance what kind of a voltage it can take. If it cannot take up to 220 volts, then you need a converter. And this will convert the 220 volts to 110 volts. And it has wattage. You have to pay attention to wattage as well. This one I like because it's got a low and a high switch for low wattage and high wattage. You can get them off of Amazon. You can buy them in stores here in town. There are things to get. But I just want you to know the difference between a converter that converts 220 to 110 and an adapter which keeps it at 220 but lets you plug your device into it. It'll say on it, well, this just says watts. Yeah. We've got an electrical expert with us right here, so you can tell us all about that. But just so you know, those are the things you need to pay attention to. So you don't want to plug something that can only take 110 volts directly into their 220 volt outlet. But if your appliance can take up through 220 or 240 volts, then all you need is the adapter. Okay, and the different adapters, their electrical plugs are kind of round like this. But this one is smaller, and it'll fit kind of more kinds of plugs. It's got the same two kind of round plugs. This is also interesting because the back side of it can take both round and flat plugs. So this plug, just like oh no, this isn't it. Let me do this one. Okay, here's what plugs into ours, and it'll go right into this. Okay, and then I can plug that in there. But this is configured so that it can also take the two round plugs. And I found that's helpful because this converter, oftentimes the receptacles are recessed, and this won't fit all the way in. So what I do is I put the converter onto this adapter, and then it'll reach into that recessed receptacle. So just a couple of things that I've picked up and learned through the years of traveling to Israel, trying to use their electrical system. When I go, my laptop computer, the brick that is with it, will go up through 240 volts. So all I do with my laptop is I use an adapter, and I plug it right into the wall, and it works fine. And then I use that to charge my phone. I plug my phone into the laptop computer. If you don't bring a computer with you, then you'll want to make sure that you bring some kind of a device that you can plug in that will not get fried, that you can plug your phone into to charge it, if you're bringing a phone. If you're not bringing a phone, you don't have to worry about that. Pardon me?
The cell phone in Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it may cost you a lot, but yeah, international calling is. Say again, Clint? Yeah, you can usually do texting. I'm not sure of the prices, and it changes from plan to plan and provider to provider. So you'll probably want to check with your cell phone provider to find out for sure. Okay.
There's a way to do it just through internet. You don't have to worry about.
Well, that's the other thing. If you bring a computer with you, or even if your phone has Wi-Fi. Okay, here's the other thing. In the hotels that we're staying in, we'll have Wi-Fi. Yes, I think in all of them. Yeah. It goes with it. I think they all have free Wi-Fi. Well, free. You pay for it. That's part of the cost of going on the tour. Pays for the hotel, and it's built in. It didn't used to be that way. Some years ago, some of the hotels had free, and others you had to pay for the Wi-Fi. But I think they all have Wi-Fi throughout the hotel that you can get. So, so I would recommend, if you have either Wi-Fi on your phone or you bring a laptop computer or something, that you communicate with friends back home that way, using instant messaging or email or something like that. Keep your cell phone making actual phone calls, maybe for emergencies.
Oh, I have a little flip phone.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Any questions about packing, clothes to take, hotels, electricity?
Is there anywhere it's preferable to have storage facilities, or is that not really?
It's not crucial. It is considered more modest for ladies to wear a skirt. There's never anything.
Same sort of like the holy sites or something.
Yeah, at the holy sites. That would be probably the preference, but there's so many tourists going over there all the time. As long as you're covered up, that's the main thing they care about. If you want to, thank you for asking that question. That brings up something else I want to mention. Always keep this in mind, that we are guests in their country. American tourists, of all people in the world, have the worst reputation for being obnoxious snobs. And I'm not saying anybody here is that way. I'm just saying Americans have that reputation. And we need to remember that we're guests in our country, and not only are we guests representing our country, more importantly, we're guests representing the Lord Jesus Christ. And we will make an impression on the people that we meet. So an extra bit of courtesy, kindness, showing respect to people goes a long way, and it's always, always the best thing to do is to be courteous, be respectful, be patient, and just remember, you're there representing the Lord. So, you know, you bear that in mind. Good. Okay, so there are no other questions. I want to get on with this evening's lecture. I should also mention there is, you should have gotten in your packet from Maranatha Tours this booklet. Okay, and so there is a good section in here in the middle on page 8 on watch that luggage. Okay, be sure you read through that, talk about what kind of luggage you can bring, what you can have. You are allowed so many pieces of luggage. Basically, you can have one piece of luggage per person plus whatever you can carry. You might be allowed more than that on the airplane, or might think, well, I'm going to pay for extra luggage on the airplane. But the problem is twofold. Number one, there's only so much room on the bus once we get there. So no matter what you take going over, we're limited on the bus from place to place. Second problem is your tour package cost pays for tipping. And when we arrive, say, at the hotel, there are porters, they're going to pick up your bags and take them up to your rooms. And the morning we leave, they'll take your bags down and pack them on the bus. And they're tipped. But they're tipped at the rate of 1 suitcase per person. So if you bring extra, then you need to plan on extra tip money. But you should be able to get by. This is only 2 weeks, so you should be able to get by. One tip is that sometimes you go and you end up picking up souvenirs. And so you find you're ready to go home and you've got more stuff than you came over there with. So if you bring a small collapsible like duffel bag or something and put it in your bag on the way over, for the way back you can bring that extra bag on the airplane, okay? But you just wait till the very end to fill that one up. So that's something to keep in mind. But it's 1 bag per person, 1 big bag per person, not counting a backpack or whatever you carry with you. And that's what the porters get paid tips for.
Will we be using the same bus the whole time?
Probably.
And then during the day, is it like space room things on the bus?
Yeah, during the days, the bus driver stays with the bus, and you can leave things on the bus. That's not a problem. But when we get off the bus at night, you take everything with you to the room. One of the reasons for that is after we go back up to our hotel rooms for the night, they go through and they clean the bus. So it needs to be completely empty. But yeah, during the day when we stop at places to tour, you don't have to pack everything around with you. Yeah. Okay, now I've given you a list of review questions for tonight's lecture. It's a long list. And not all of these questions will be on the quiz for those that are taking this class for credit. But we'll just take a look at the first few of these. The whole first side and the first question on the second side is all about Jerusalem. We started talking about Jerusalem. We're going to say more about it tonight. But we want you to be able to show on a map of Israel the location of the following sites: Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So in your booklets, in your map here, if you just want to turn there right now to page 5, I guess. Jerusalem is number 20, and just south of Jerusalem is Bethlehem. Yeah, it's on page 5 of the booklet. What's that? Bethlehem is in the West Bank. Yes, thank you for asking that. And you'll find out when we go to Bethlehem, we will be passing through a checkpoint. We'll pass through several checkpoints as we go between Israel and West Bank, from time to time, place to place. And one of those is in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is surrounded by the security wall. Okay, we can't build one here in America, but they have security walls in Israel, and they work. We will go through the entrance into Bethlehem. There may be a armed soldier get on the bus and come through and take a look at everybody, check us out. That's good. We want that kind of security. And we will be totally safe. But then we will go into Bethlehem. It used to be that when we went into Bethlehem, then our Israeli tour guide had to go to the cafe and wait for us, and a Palestinian tour guide came on and went with us through Bethlehem. And when we got back, then our Israeli tour guide got back on. So that's changed. That's all changed. Now our Israeli tour guide stays with us the whole time. Yeah. There are areas of Israel, Area A, Area B, Area C. They're designated, and these are areas that have to do with the West Bank. Some areas are controlled by Israel, but they're considered Palestinian West Bank. Other areas are partly controlled by Israel and partly controlled by the Palestinian Authority in their West Bank. And then other areas are 100% controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and those are the areas where pretty much Jews aren't even allowed to enter. And but Bethlehem is not a big problem. We'll talk a little bit about Bethlehem a little bit later on tonight. Yeah. So here are the things. Jerusalem, then number 20 on that map, and just south of that you'll see Bethlehem. Bethlehem is, I would say, if you try to liken it to something around here, Bethlehem is to Jerusalem like Anderson is to Reading. Okay, it's just the next town over, and it only takes a few minutes to drive from one to the next. It's not very far away. So when we read about David born in Bethlehem, that David the son of Jesse, David who slew Goliath, he goes and conquers Bethlehem, or conquers Jerusalem, makes it the capital of Israel when he's king. He's conquering a city that he's known about all his life. He's grown up around. As he shepherded his father's flocks, he no doubt was around Jerusalem all the time. So this territory that was familiar to him. So yeah, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, they're neighboring towns. But Jerusalem was the big main city. Bethlehem, not so much. Okay, Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Number 2, where is the Mount of Olives located in relation to Jerusalem? We actually talked about this last week. I'll review that tonight. The principal water source for the city of Jerusalem in biblical times, and where is that water source located? Try to locate that for you tonight. How old are the old city walls that stand in Jerusalem today? I mentioned that last week, didn't I? Okay. We'll try to repeat that tonight. Describe the location of the biblical city of Jerusalem in relation to the old city walls. 6, describe the location of the Temple Mount in relation to the old city walls. So questions 5 and 6 are similar to each other, but they are distinct questions. And we'll show that again. 7, what was the name of Jerusalem in the following period? So we can talk about pre-Israelite 3rd millennium. We can talk about pre-Israelite 2nd millennium, and then in the Israelite period. Those would be 3 different stages with 3 different names. 8, who was the king of Jerusalem in the time of Abraham? 9, who ruled Jerusalem at the time of the conquest of Canaan under Joshua? 10, who is responsible for building the first temple in Jerusalem and the approximate date? When were Jerusalem and the temple destroyed and Israel carried into Babylonian captivity? Number 12, who was the Babylonian king who was responsible for the destruction and captivity? 13, when and under what conditions did Israel return from Babylonian captivity? 14, who was responsible for building the second temple in Jerusalem? What was the approximate date? 15, what Seleucid ruler defiled the temple and when? So if you don't know who the Seleucids were, we'll try to mention that when we get to that point. Number 16, who greatly expanded the temple complex and when? And 17, who destroyed the second temple and when? Number 18, who erected temples to Juno and Minerva on the Temple Mount and when? 19, what was Jerusalem renamed after its destruction? 20, who built the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa mosques on the Temple Mount? When did that happen? 21, what are the dates of the British Mandate? 22, what was the official British position of the Jews' relationship to Palestine? And what notable document supports this position? We're obviously getting up into modern times now, 20th century. Number 23, what was the status of Jerusalem according to the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947? 24, what was the status of Jerusalem as a result of Israel's war for independence, 1948? And one more question about Jerusalem, number 25, what was the status of Jerusalem as a result of the 6 Days War in 1967? So here are a lot of questions that have to do with Jerusalem. So by way of review from last week, notice that when we think about Jerusalem, we're talking about 3 valleys and 2 hills. So the 3 valleys are the Kidron Valley, which runs from north to south and separates Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. So the Mount of Olives over here lies to the east of Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem, this is east. We read about the Mount of Olives in the Gospels frequently. The Mount of Olives was actually not part of Jerusalem. It lay outside of the boundaries of the city of Jerusalem. The second valley is the Tyropoeon Valley, running roughly parallel to the Kidron and running on the other side of where the temple will be. And it is not a very deep valley. Today, most of it is filled in, not even recognizable as a valley. But at its southern end, down here, it's deeper and is more noticeably a valley. The third valley, the Valley of Ben Hinnom, or the Valley of Hinnom, Gehinnom, Gehenna, Hell. This is the valley that curves around. And these three valleys then demarcate the two major hills of Jerusalem. Okay, Mount of Olives is outside of Jerusalem, but the two hills are, number one, Mount Zion, or Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah, all the same place. Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, Temple Mount. And it has both a northern end and a southern end. The southern end has the original city of Jerusalem. Just this narrow, skinny thing with this wall around it. And this is the city that David conquered and made the capital of Jerusalem. David wanted to build a temple. God would not allow him to build a temple because he was a man of much bloodshed. And so he commissioned his son Solomon, the next king, to build the temple. David had purchased this upper region of Mount Zion from Araunah the Jebusite as a location for the temple. Now, while we're here, let me just bring up a topic that arose just this last week. In fact, as a follow-up to last week's lecture. Somebody asked me about a theory that has become popular in the last couple of years. Bob Cornicky has published this theory, and maybe some of you have heard it, but he is saying that the temple wasn't up here, but rather it was down here in the city of David. There are a number of problems with that. The size of that temple fitting in the city of David would be a problem. A second problem is that an archaeologist by the name of Eilat Mazar has been excavating down here in the city of David, and she has located right where Bob Cornicky thinks the temple stood. She has excavated what she is quite certain is the Palace of David. And the temple was not on top of the palace. Okay, but he's trying to locate it actually down here by Gihon Spring. One of the questions for tonight is the water source for Israel. It's Gihon Spring. Okay. So the temple was not down here in the city of David. The temple was up here. When you have a threshing floor, you want a threshing floor up towards the top of a mountain where you can pick up the breeze. That's the whole point of having a threshing floor. So you would not build a threshing floor down here in the city where you've got houses and walls all around it blocking the wind. You want to come up out of the city, up on the heights. So even the Cornicky's theory became quite popular a couple of years ago, and there's still a lot of people who believe in it. It has been pretty much soundly rejected by scholars and archaeologists, people who live in Israel and know and have seen it. You'll be able to see that when we're there, that it's just, there's no way that the temple could have been down in the city of David. But this is this first mountain. This is Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, Temple Mount. Here is where Abraham offered his son Isaac in sacrifice, and later it became the site of the temple. Down below here, the city of David, or Jerusalem. The second mountain that is demarcated by these valleys is called the Western Hill. The Western Hill. And that's all the name of it. We don't have a specific name in the Bible that's given to this. And it was not originally part of Jerusalem. Originally, it was just bare land out there. And but as Jerusalem expanded, particularly under Solomon, this city could not contain all the people that were coming to live there. And so the city began to expand across this Tyropoeon Valley onto the western hill. This is why we see these walls coming out here, which are probably more likely from the time of Hezekiah than from Solomon. We don't know how far Solomon expanded out here. So in our review questions, it asks where the Mount of Olives is located. There we have it, east of Jerusalem. Then it asks, what was the primary water source? Primary water source was Gihon Spring, G-I-H-O-N, Gihon. And we talked about Hezekiah's tunnel just a little bit ago. And some of you, maybe most of you, will walk through it. Gihon Spring is where the tunnel begins, and it snakes around here in an S shape, ending up at the Pool of Siloam, or the Pool of Shiloach. Shiloach, the Pool of Sending. And that pool also, just in recent years, has been excavated. He used to come out of Hezekiah's tunnel into this little tiny pool that was about as big as this section up here in front of your tables. And I remember they told us, here's the Pool of Siloam. And then a few years ago, they were digging, and they came across a wall, and they dug some more. They found some steps going down. They dug some more, and they found this was a huge, huge thing with a wall around it. And there's this thing bigger than an Olympic swimming pool that is, that's Pool of Siloam. And apparently it was a huge, it's called a mikvah, for ritual cleansing, ritual purity before you go up to the temple. And it was big enough to handle all the pilgrims that would come flooding into Jerusalem at the time of the festivals. So when we look at the Pool of Siloam here now, that's what we're looking at. And you might wonder, well, if the Pool of Siloam is way down here, why are they going here to get cleansed to go up to the temple? As these excavations continued, they discovered behind a wall a tunnel. Not Hezekiah's tunnel, a different tunnel. And it heads straight up in the direction of the temple. They now have dug all the way through that tunnel, and it comes all the way up here to the temple. So pilgrims could come and purify themselves and go through a special tunnel, brings them up to the temple in a state of ritual purity, and then they could go offer their sacrifices or whatever business they had to do at the temple. And we'll get a chance probably to go through that tunnel, or at least a significant portion of it as well. Is there anybody in here that gets claustrophobia? Okay, last time we went, we had a lady who gets claustrophobic. She got partway through that tunnel, had a very unpleasant experience. We got her through it all right, but she was pretty panicky, and the rest of the trip wasn't very pleasant for her. So, yeah, it's cramped, and then you go through, and then you come out. So anyway, you may want to just keep that in mind and see how you're feeling. And
So the overhead doesn't shrink, is it just the width that?
It's a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. It's not like you have to get down on hands and knees or anything, but there are places where you stooped over for a little bit, but not constantly.
Not the type where we have you crawling on your stomach.
Yeah.
They also you can get
Okay. So we have these this water source, Gihon Spring, and it puts out quite a healthy flow of water. It's quite something. Of course, it could never supply the water system for Jerusalem today. Today, Israel's water system is mostly, almost exclusively from desalinated water coming out of the Mediterranean. It used to come out of the Sea of Galilee, and the big water system used to pump water all throughout the land of Israel, but because of the drought, they've had to stop doing that the last couple of years. And they actually now are planning on trying to pump desalinated water from the Mediterranean into the Sea of Galilee to help replenish the water supply there. And then this other project that I talked about, taking water from the Red Sea to bring it up to the Dead Sea. So they have all kinds of issues with water in Israel. And we here in California know what it's like to have several years of drought.
The showers are like normal?
Yeah, pretty much normal, yeah.
They don't have those special heads on there.
Yeah, they have kind of low flow shower heads. Yeah. And the toilets also, most of the toilets you'll see have like the two handles on the flusher, you know, one for large volumes and the other for lower volumes. I'll just leave it at that, okay? I'll get probably too much of the picture. Okay, moving right along. One of the questions asks about the location of the biblical city of Jerusalem in relationship to the old city walls. So remember that these old city walls are not old in the sense of biblical. In fact, if you are looking at your booklet, on page 18 of your booklet, page 18, we're under geography, which is number 2. Under that, you have point A, 3 valleys, point B, 2 hills, point C, the water source. There's the Gihon Spring right there. And notice under point D, Old City versus the biblical city. And point number 1, the Old City, here it is, a wall constructed in A.D. 1538. So if you think about that date, I mean, well, that sounds like it's pretty old to us, but in terms of biblical history, that's not old at all. Okay, the Protestant Reformation started in 1517. Okay, so we're now after the Protestant Reformation has been going on. Now that's in Western Europe, the Protestant Reformation. What's going on back in the good old Holy Land? You have the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire. And it was the Ottoman Turks under the ruler Suleiman I who constructs these walls that are called the Old City Walls. So in answer to the question, how old are the Old City Walls that stand in Jerusalem today? That's the answer. Okay, they were constructed in 1538. And but the really old city walls that aren't still standing today, the walls that were the walls of the city that David conquered, are here on the lower regions of Mount Zion. Here's Mount Zion, coming from up here all the way down to here. The Old Testament Jerusalem is entirely outside of the old city walls. Seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? And so you have to realize, some of you on our free day may want to walk around the city walls, the old city walls, which is a really neat thing to do, and I would encourage you to do that. But just realize that when you're doing that, part of Old Testament Jerusalem, even New Testament Jerusalem, is not within those walls. When you get around to the south side, you got to look the other direction outside of those city walls to see where the biblical city was. Okay. Now, as Jerusalem expanded under Solomon, it expanded north to encompass the temple, and the temple now was up in here inside these Ottoman city walls. So here's still the city of David, and then you come up in here, here's where the Temple Mount is. So when you visit Jerusalem today, you want to go see the temple, you can come around here to the south side, come in through this gate, which is the Dung Gate, and that's where you're going to go up to the Western Wall Plaza, and then go up through what's called the Mugrabi Gate up onto the Temple Mount. So, Temple is inside these old city walls, but the old city of David is outside the old city walls. Get the picture? Okay. All right, same situation here under Nehemiah. This is post-Babylonian captivity after the Jews come back. Following 70 years of Babylonian captivity, they come back into the land. They rebuild the temple. They rebuild the city. We're talking about a second temple now. When we talk about temples in Jerusalem, there have been two temples. The first was built by Solomon, destroyed by the Babylonians. Then 70 years of Babylonian captivity. The second temple was built under the ministry of Ezra. And that was the temple that Jesus came into. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year AD 70. A weird quirk of history is that both the first temple and the second temple were destroyed on the same day of the year. The Hebrew calendar was the 9th day of the month of. Okay, the 9th day of the month of. 9th in Hebrew is Tisha. And so every year on the 9th of Av, Israel has a day of commemoration called Tisha B'Av. And what the historians have found as they've studied the 9th of Av is that throughout the history of Israel, there have been numerous events that occurred on Tisha B'Av that had an impact on the Jews. On Tisha B'Av, the Jews were expelled from Spain. On Tisha B'Av, the Nazis declared their final solution. And there are a number of events like this that happened on that same day of the year. Now, is that coincidence? Is there something going on here? It's just interesting to think about. But first and foremost, the 9th of Av was the day on which both temples were destroyed. And we'll have something about that, I think, in a moment. Let's see here. So, after the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, they build the second temple. That same temple is standing in the days of the Lord Jesus. But the temple had gone through several stages of renovation. When you read in the book of Ezra about the building and the dedication of the temple, we're told that some of the old men wept because they remembered the glory of Solomon's temple. And this new temple was nothing by comparison. Now, most of the Jews were rejoicing, as they should have, because now the temple's rebuilt. Now we can restore the worship of God. But those that remembered Solomon's temple said, boy, this is a sorry excuse for a temple. Now, we go from these post-exilic books of the Bible, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Those were all written after he returned from Babylonian captivity. We move from there into what's called the intertestamental period. 400 years, roughly, between the last book of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. A lot of history takes place during the intertestamental era. And one of the things that's happening in the land of Israel is the Greeks come into power. And there is a power struggle between two groups of Greeks. Alexander the Great's empire breaks up between his 4 generals. And ruling Syria up in the north, you have the Seleucids. Ruling Egypt to the south, you have the Ptolemies. And the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are fighting with each other, trying to control more territory. Well, right in between the two is poor little Israel. And You have heard, no doubt, about this one Seleucid ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus was something of a madman. He was zealous for Greek culture, and he wanted to ensure that Greek culture was observed strictly in all the territory that he controlled. So as he sought to control the land of Israel, he imposed very, very harsh law. He outlawed the practice of Judaism. He outlawed the practice of circumcision. Any Jewish mothers who circumcised their child would be subject to a penalty of death. He imposed on all Jews a requirement that they participate in the Greek Games, the Olympics. And in ancient times, the Olympics were performed naked. And so it would be obvious if any males were circumcised. So Antiochus used this as a means of controlling the Jewish population. But Antiochus was also greedy. He was fighting a war with the Ptolemies down in Egypt. And as his coffers became emptied by the cost of war, he had a need to replenish his supplies. And on his trips through the land of Israel, he found that there was a temple in Jerusalem, and this temple had plenty of gold in it. So he violates the temple. He enters it, he takes the gold. He desecrates the temple because he doesn't like Judaism anyway, and sacrifices a pig, an unclean animal, on the altar. And then the temple lies in ruins while Antiochus is in control. But there arose a band of freedom fighters called the Maccabees. And they waged guerrilla warfare against the Seleucid rulers and eventually overcome them and overpower them, retake Jerusalem, and cleanse the temple and kind of redo the temple. So under the Maccabees, the temple was cleansed, was rededicated, was beautified. So this is like the second phase. And we don't know exactly how much they did. We don't have a lot of very specific records. And we have even less information about what the specific temple that Ezra rebuilt looked like, other than that it was not to be compared with Solomon's. But what we do know is that the third phase comes along in about 30 BC, when a man by the name of Herod the Great rises to power in Israel. Now by this time, the Greeks are gone. Ptolemies, Seleucids, their empire has fallen to another world power, the Romans. Herod, of Edomite descent, he's called an Idumean, which means an Edomite. He has political aspirations. He travels to Rome, and he goes to Caesar and says, look, you're having problems with this area of Judea. If you will appoint me as king of the Jews, I will be loyal to you, and you'll have no more problems there. Caesar says that's a deal. And so Rome gives to Herod the Great the title of King of the Jews. Herod was also desperate to be loved and appreciated by the Jews. In fact, he was kind of enamored with Judaism. He wanted to convert to Judaism. He was in love with a Jewish woman by the name of Miriam, whom he marries. And so he did all kinds of things trying to win the favor of the Jews. Now, he also did some terrible things because he was, I mean, if Antiochus Epiphanes was a madman, Herod the Great was 10 times more the madman. He was a crazy man. He was afraid of his position, so afraid he didn't even trust his own family. He had members of his own immediate family, even his own sons, put to death because he was afraid they would take his kingdom from him. So and he was killing people right and left. But at the same time, he was also trying to make nicey nice with the Jews. One of the things he did was he put just immense effort into expanding and beautifying the temple. So when we talk about the second temple has at least 3 phases. There's an Ezra phase, there's a Maccabean phase, and there's a Herodian phase. It's all the same temple. It never really gets destroyed, but it keeps getting expanded and beautified. And the temple at the time of Jesus is still the second temple, okay? But it's this Herodian temple that we're talking about. And look at the Herodian expansion of the city walls. The city walls at the time of Herod are almost as extensive as the Ottoman walls, okay? With the exception of this little part out here, this little section out here. But these dark walls are Herod's walls, encompassing, of course, the Temple Mount. And Herod even widened the Temple Mount platform, and he made the temple itself much larger. We are told that architecturally, Herod's temple was grander and more beautiful than Solomon's temple in terms of its architecture. But one thing made Solomon's temple grander than Herod's temple, and that was the glory of God. So the prophet Ezekiel sees the Shekinah glory, the glory of God, departing from the first temple, leaving the first temple eastward, going across the Kidron Valley and over the Mount of Olives. And it does not return until the closing chapters of Ezekiel's prophecy, which shows the glory of God coming into not the second temple, but the temple of the millennium, a yet future temple. So this temple in Herod's day, as grand and glorious as it was, it never possessed the Shekinah glory of God, except for one time. When was that? It was when Jesus entered. Because Jesus was the glory of God. And when Jesus went into the second temple, just for a brief time, we could say the glory of God visited that temple. But the actual visible glory of God, the Shekinah glory, will not come back to Temple Mount until the millennial kingdom. Okay. This is what the city looks like today. Here are those walls, the Ottoman walls, divided into 4 quarters. There's a Christian quarter, Armenian quarter, Muslim quarter, and Jewish quarter. And what I want to do when we come back is talk a little bit about the old city today and the gates of the city. But first, I think we're going to stop and take a break. There is some food down in the student lounge, and they've invited us to come and take part of it. They're having a special student event to celebrate the Chinese New Year. So, you know, students will use any excuse for a party, right? So you're welcome to go help yourself. And we're going to break for, well, let's say we'll take a 15-minute break. That'll give you time to pick up something to eat and have a little snack. We'll come back. Okay, so welcome back. We're going to get started up right away again. And as we are thinking about our review questions dealing with Jerusalem, one of the questions, number 7, says, what was the name of Jerusalem in each of the following periods? And in your booklets, you have this on page 19, the name of Jerusalem at various periods. So in the 3rd millennium BC, we're going back now to the time of Abraham. And the first time we encounter Jerusalem is Abraham's meeting of Melchizedek. And at this time, the name of the city was Salem, S-A-L-E-M, 3rd millennium BC. This is right in the middle of page 19, History A, pre-Israelite. At the time of Abraham, about 2000 BC, the city went by the name Salem, related to the Hebrew word for peace, and was ruled by the priest king Melchizedek, or Melchizedek. And then, secondly, what was the name of it during the pre-Israelite 2nd millennium BC? 2nd millennium is going to be, prior to 1000. Okay, up to 1000 be 1st millennium, and then from 1000 to 2000, 2nd millennium. At this time, we find that a group of Canaanites from a tribe called the Jebusites is inhabiting the city, and it is named Jebus. So whether the Jebusites gave the name of their tribe to the city, or whether they took their name from the city, we don't know. But the Jebusites lived there, and it's called Jebus, which is related to Jebusite. So at the time of the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, about 1400 BC, so now we're 2nd millennium, the city went by the name Jebus. And this was the name of the city when it was conquered by David and made the capital of Israel.
Was there a specific king that was ruling at the time of Joshua?
Yes, there was.
Who you're looking for,
No, all I'm looking for is the name of the Jebusites. So, I'm not really that concerned about you knowing the name of the Jebusite king at that time. So who ruled it? The Jebusites. Then we move into the Israelite period, and we kind of touched on this last hour, but we have a first temple and a second temple. And we'll just kind of review a little bit. First temple, 970 BC. So David is king about 1000 BC. That's a nice round figure. It's easy to remember. David is king about 1000. So 970 is when Solomon now becomes king and begins constructing the temple, the first temple. So this is the first temple. Solomon builds the first Israelite temple, expanding the city walls to the north to encompass Mount Moriah as the site for the temple. And again, as I mentioned earlier tonight, you have this alternate theory that's been put out that the temple was built further south in the city of David. That's been pretty well debunked, even though there are many people who kind of like that. If you just watch the video, there's a YouTube video on this, it sounds pretty convincing. But then when you start talking to people who know better and they start pointing out some of the problems with this YouTube video, it's really, in my mind, there's no question. The temple was never down by Gihon Spring. It was always up on Temple Mount, where it's located today. During the Babylonian captivity, of course, then the temple lies in ruins. So the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, 586 BC. That's when the temple was destroyed, and it was the Babylonians who destroyed it. Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, his army. So who destroyed the first temple? Answer, Nebuchadnezzar. And here under point 3, page 19 at the bottom of the page, Nebuchadnezzar destroys the city and the temple, causing many Israelites, or carrying many Israelites from Jerusalem into captivity. As a city, Jerusalem lay in ruins until Persian rulers permitted the Jews to return and rebuild the temple and the city. So if you remember your history from this period of time, you have Babylon, and then Babylon is overtaken by a coalition between the Medes and the Persians. Dan.
On number 7, what was the name of Jerusalem, Egypt, city of following period? Is it Israelite? Who is there a certain name?
Yeah, so 7a, the answer to that is Salem. 7b is Jebus, J-E-B-U-S. And then Israelite period, Jerusalem. When David takes over the city, he no longer calls it Jebus, but he calls it Jerusalem. Yeah. And the interesting thing is there are still Jebusites who continue to live in the city. This is why when David looks for a place to locate an altar, he purchases the threshing floor from Araunah, the what? The Jebusite. Who was Bathsheba's husband?
Uriah the Hittite.
Uriah the Hittite. The Hittites were another Canaanite nation. But Uriah was a mighty hero in David's army. So David has these associations with all kinds of Canaanites, Jebusites, Hittites, and other people, even though they are among the nations that God had told the Israelites to destroy utterly. So we have to realize that you have godly people living in Old Testament times who were godly, but not perfect. Okay? Just like you and I know of Christian people who are godly, good Christian people, but they're not perfect, are they? And neither are you, and neither am I. So we shouldn't fantasize about the people we read about in the Bible. They were human beings, just like we are, with all the same kinds of flaws that people have today. Yeah. Okay, so during the Israelite city, and the answer to that question, again on 19 down to the bottom, the Israelite period beginning in 1000 with David. So David conquered the Jebusite city, making it the capital of the United Kingdom of Israel. And this is when we come into the first temple period, Solomon, destroyed by Babylon in 586. And then the Jews are allowed to return by the Persians. So the Medes and the Persians take the ascendancy. They become the sole rulers. And I just want you to follow along with this. You don't need to know all of this, I guess, for the quiz, but it's really interesting to trace the progression that's going on here as the Jews return from Babylonian captivity. Down at the bottom of page 19, 4a, a series of 4 edicts from 3 different Persian rulers allowed the Jews to return from captivity and begin rebuilding the temple and then the city itself. So 539 BC, Cyrus allowed some of the Jews to return and begin rebuilding the temple. So one of the questions asks, question number 10, asks who is responsible for building the first temple, okay, and the date we have that's Solomon. When were Jerusalem and the temple destroyed and Israel carried into Babylonian captivity? That's your 586 by the Babylonians. 12, the Babylonian king responsible was Nebuchadnezzar. We answered that. 13, when, under what conditions did Israel return from the Babylonian captivity? Now, that's what we're getting into now. Okay. When and under what conditions? It was during the rule of the Persians. And that's what we're talking about here. Beginning in 539. 539 is when you have your first Persian edict allowing the Jews to return. But notice this, Cyrus's edict said nothing about rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. It only detailed the building of the temple, and that was the first concern. And the main individual responsible for rebuilding the temple was Ezra. And we have a book of the Bible named after Ezra. Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra returns in 539 under Cyrus's edict, and they begin rebuilding the temple. Notice a second edict in 519 BC, following a suspension of building the temple due to Tatnai's interference, and that's recorded in the book of Ezra, chapter 5. Darius restored the earlier edict of Cyrus, according to Ezra 6, verses 1 through 12. So work on the temple picks up again. A third edict was given by the Persian ruler Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes actually issued two decrees. The first in 457, allowing a number of Jews to return with Ezra for further rebuilding and enhancement of the temple in Ezra chapter 7. But the one that really kind of interests us in some respects is the edict of 444 BC, different from the former three in that Artaxerxes' decree of 444 allowed Nehemiah to go back and rebuild the city walls. Prior to that time, it seems the Persian rulers were uneasy with the idea of the Jews rebuilding the city, because the history of this city has been that it was a very powerful city. The Persian rulers didn't want anybody challenging their rule in the area. So they said, you can have a temple, but we don't want you building a city. But God worked on the heart of Artaxerxes, and in 444, he allows the rebuilding of the city. And it's this edict which figures into the prophecy found in Daniel chapter 9 about 70 sevens, determined upon your people and upon your holy city, Jerusalem. There'll be 69 sevens until the Messiah comes. Then after the 69th seven, Messiah will be cut off. And then it goes on to talk about the 70th seven, which to us is still future. That's the tribulation period. But there have been 69 of those sevens were fulfilled until the coming of the Messiah was fulfilled very accurately, specifically to the day that Christ entered Jerusalem for what we call the triumphal entry. And this is figuring into these edicts that we're reading about. So God is sovereignly working through the Persian rulers to fulfill the prophecy that he made through Daniel. So still on page 20, point B, Jerusalem remained under the authority of the Persians until the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. This is where we get into the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. They come from Alexander the Great. So we get the Hellenistic period. Hellenistic means Greek. Hellenistic period runs from 332 to 63 BC. So here you have Alexander, you got dates for the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans arise as Jewish priest kings, and they ruled for a while from Jerusalem. And they really were not very good kings. They descended from the Maccabees. Maccabees were great Jewish heroes for defeating the Greeks. People appreciated them, and they appointed their descendants as rulers over Israel. But these were from the tribe of Levi. They were not from the tribe of Judah. They were never authorized by God to be kings over Israel. These are the Hasmoneans. In 63, we begin the Roman period. We talked about Herod, an Edomite, called an Idumean. Here he is, 2/3 of the way down page 20. Herod the Great, an Idumean, wrests control of Israel from the Hasmoneans. In 40 BC, succeeds being named king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. And under Herod's rule, Jerusalem expands northward. Okay, let's see on our questions if we're missing anything yet. Okay, the king of Jerusalem at the time of Abraham, that was Melchizedek. Ruled Jerusalem at the time of conquest under Canaan, under Joshua. Okay, you've got the Jebusites. Okay, I've gone over all this. Let's see. Number 14 is responsible for rebuilding the second temple in Jerusalem. That would be Ezra, would be the name for that. And the approximate date you have it in your notes. The Seleucid ruler who defiled the temple, and when? That's Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay. Who greatly expanded the temple complex? The answer to that question is Herod the Great. beginning in about 40 BC. And you have that here, 40 BC succeeds being named King of the Jews, and shortly after that he begins expanding the temple. Who destroyed the second temple? So the second temple, the same temple that's standing in the days of Jesus, destroyed by the Romans. And specifically, the general of the army was a man named Titus. And in 70 AD, fulfilling the prophecy that was given by Jesus, not one stone was left upon another. So who erected temples to Juno and Minerva on the Temple Mount? Let's find this as we go at the bottom of page 20. Here we have pagan Roman period of Jerusalem, AD 70 to 324. AD 70, Jerusalem destroyed by the Roman armies led by General Titus. Look at point B. This is the answer to the question we were just looking at. In 175, Jerusalem is renamed Aelia Capitolina. So here's another name for the city, and that was the name given by the Romans. Judea was renamed Palestine, and the Temple Mount has temples erected for the Roman gods Juno and Minerva, and in town another temple to Jupiter. So Juno, Minerva, and Jupiter are known as the Capitoline gods. This is why the city was called Aelia Capitolina, the city of the Capitoline gods. This was a way that Emperor Hadrian had of insulting the Jews. In the 2nd century, around 130, there was a second Jewish revolt against Rome. The first revolt had been put down in 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem. But then another revolt emerged in the 2nd century. A young man by the name of Bar Kokhba arose. And many of the Jews thought that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. Bar Kokhba is Aramaic. It means the son of the stars. Son of the stars. And he, like the Maccabees, began fighting a guerrilla warfare against, in this case, the Romans, whereas the Maccabees were fighting against the Greeks, the Seleucids. Bar Kokhba is carrying on this guerrilla warfare, and he's gaining some success. And his followers are getting quite excited. We're going to do the same thing the Maccabees did, they think. But they did not succeed. They were finally defeated by Emperor Hadrian. And Hadrian is filled with such rage against these Jews who dared to defy the power of Rome. He evicts the Jews from Judea. They're gone from Jerusalem. They're gone from Bethlehem. And he says, I'm going to rename the city. It's no longer going to be called Jerusalem. I'm going to name it after Roman gods. Earlier, we destroyed the temple. Now, in its place, we're going to erect temples to the Roman gods. And the whole region that was previously known as Judea, Hadrian says in the 130s, we're going to name it Palestine. Where did he get the name Palestine? Well, the name Palestine is derived from the name Philistine. It's linguistically almost exactly the same as Philistine. So it doesn't sound like it, but the PH and the P are the same letter. So Philistine, Palestine. This is where the name comes from. So since the Philistines were the ancient enemies of the Jews, Hadrian says, we're naming this place Palestine. Now, previously, the name Palestine had been used by the Greeks to define the region right down around Gaza. And that was the ancient location of the Philistines. You read about the five great cities, the pentathlon of the Philistines. That was right down at Gaza and Ashkelon and Gath and a couple of others. Okay, but that was all right down there. Today, if you look on a map of Israel, you see the Gaza Strip. It's basically that region. That was Palestine to the Greeks. Hadrian then expands that term, uses it to describe the entire area of Judea. Now that name stuck and stayed with the land all through the Middle Ages up to modern times. And even today, sometimes you hear the land referred to as Palestine. You'll see that written in books. I, for one, am not comfortable using the name Palestine. And so whenever I see the name Palestine, I'll just substitute the name Israel, because I know where the name Palestine came from. Hadrian wanted to insult the Jews, and I don't want to insult the Jews. The Abrahamic covenant, Abrahamic promise of Genesis chapter 12 promises, I will bless him that blesses you, I'll curse him that curses you. But personally, I want to be in on that blessing. Okay, so I refuse to use the name Palestine unless I'm talking about the origin of the name Palestine. And I'll talk about it, define it, talk about where it came from. But if I'm referring to the land, its proper name is the land of Israel, and the southern portion of that is Judea, because it was the tribal allotment of the tribe of Judah. Okay, so how are we doing on these questions here? Who erected temples to Juno, Minerva, and Temple Mount, and when? Okay, so this is, you could just say the Romans if you want, but it was Emperor Hadrian, Hadrian. Okay, so we're going to come to that. 19 asks, what was Jerusalem renamed after its destruction? Okay, Aelia Capitolina. Number 20, who built the Dome of the Rock? So in every picture you see of Jerusalem, you always see the golden domed structure there. And it is on the Temple Mount. Well, we have a first Byzantine period, 324 to 614. We'll skip over that. We have a Persian period from 614 to 629. We have a second Byzantine period from 629 to 638. Who are the Byzantines? The Byzantines were the Romans after they accepted Christianity. That's all. Basically, it's Christianized Rome is Byzantine. Now we come to the first Muslim period, 638. It's not until about 610 that Muhammad begins to formulate the religion of Islam down in what we would call Saudi Arabia. And Muhammad begins to move out from Mecca and Medina, his first two spots, and begin to cover increasing territories. And he converts by the edge of the sword. In other words, you become Muslim, or that's it. You're headless. And he expands to the west across North Africa, and he expands to the north up towards Syria and encompassing the land of Israel. And eventually Israel falls to the Muslims. So this is the first Muslim period, 638 to 1099. And under that, the first portion of the Muslim rules under a group of Arabs called the Umayyads. You have an Umayyad dynasty, an Abbasid dynasty, a Fatimid dynasty, and the Seljuk Turks after them. But it's under the Umayyads that the Dome of the Rock is built between 638 and 750. So the Dome of the Rock is built first, and then shortly after that, Al-Aqsa Mosque. So what are these two buildings? Well, the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. It is sometimes referred to as a mosque, but that's not correct. It is actually a memorial building. The Dome of the Rock is an octagonal shaped building right here. It's built over the site that most people believe was the original site of the temples. Now, there are varying theories. Talk about Bob Cornicky's theory, which we'll reject. There are a couple of other theories. One place is slightly north of this in a place called the Dome of the Chains, or the Dome of the Spirits. And another theory puts it south of this. If either of these locations are correct, the temple actually could be built today without doing anything to the Dome of the Rock. But most people hold that the temple was built where the Dome of the Rock stands. It is an octagonal shaped building. The Byzantines built memorial structures with octagonal shapes. They were built on significant sites to remember either an occurrence, an event, or where somebody important was buried. In this case, it commemorates the site of the temple, but it's not a mosque. So a little bit after the Dome of the Rock was built, down here in the southern end of the Temple Mount was built a mosque. And this is Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa means the farthest. Now, just throw this in. In the Quran, the holy book of Islam, how many times do you think Jerusalem is mentioned? The answer is 0. Jerusalem is not mentioned even one time in the Quran. So why is Jerusalem always referred to as the third holiest site in Islam? The answer is, it was not considered the third holiest site until fairly recent times. In fact, I can show you photographs from the early era of photography taken of the Temple Mount, and the place is kind of in ruins, kind of a shambles. Doesn't look at all like a holy site. Not until the modern conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis that they tried to say, this is ours, you can't have it. But at any rate, the Quran does mention the farthest mosque. It mentions Al-Aqsa, because there was a vision that Muhammad had of traveling to Al-Aqsa Mosque and from there ascending into heaven. And then he comes back to the earth and returns to Mecca. So where is Al-Aqsa Mosque? Well, the Quran doesn't say. It doesn't say that it was in Jerusalem. It doesn't say where it was. Actually, there are some who believe they know where Al-Aqsa was, and it's down in Saudi Arabia. And there's some pretty good evidence to support this particular theory. But they have come to refer to this as the mosque that Muhammad visited. And that's the common belief among most Muslims of today. But the mosque is not on the temple. The temple is under the memorial building, the Dome of the Rock. So 2 buildings on Temple Mount, Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Yeah.
What is the Dome of the Rock supposed to be for? Is it supposed to be to commemorate
Okay.
the Jewish temple?
Yeah, originally it was to commemorate the Jewish temple. Under the Dome of the Rock is an outcropping of rock. Now, what you're looking at here, this is a plaza. Okay, so Temple Mount is a mountain. How do you build on top of a mountain? You either have to level it off, or in biblical times, you build retaining walls around it and then lay a plaza on top. That's what you have on the Temple Mount. At the highest point of Mount Moriah, the underlying mountain comes up through the plaza. And this is underneath the Dome of the Rock. So it would be the highest point of the mountain. Now, the rock outcropping actually has interesting areas carved out of it. There's one that is almost exactly the right dimensions for the Ark of the Covenant. So this is one of the reasons that many believe this was the site of the temple, because it looks like there's a place just carved out in the rock, just perfect for the Ark of the Covenant to be there. Okay. But as I said, there are these other theories. Some place the temple up here, some place the temple down here. But what's there? Well, it was originally to commemorate the temple. Now, okay, let's come back. in that rock outcropping, in the side of it, there's a little indentation. Okay? So the Muslim story is that that indentation was made by Muhammad's heel when he ascended into heaven. So what they will do is the Muslims who visit this site, they will go in, they'll touch that indentation and kiss their hand.
Are we allowed to go there?
Not anymore. We used to. I've been in there. We can go in, we can look all around, we can take pictures. There's a cave underneath the rock in here. We used to be able to go down to that cave. We haven't been able to do that for years though now. Same with Al-Aqsa. We used to go into Al-Aqsa Mosque. But that's all off limits now. But we can go up here on the Temple Mount. We can walk all around. We can see all around the outside of these buildings. We just can't go inside either of these two buildings. Okay.
Is there any significance to Abraham going to Mount Moriah? Is there a spot that they?
We don't know. Yeah, no, we just don't know. So the question was about Abraham. Where did he offer Isaac? We just don't know. Presumably it would have been at the height of the mountain, same place underneath the Dome of the Rock, but we don't know that for sure. And the Bible doesn't really give us any hint where on the mountain he was when he offered Isaac. He went up there somewhere. You know, I guess if you're climbing up a mountain, you're probably going to go up to the top of the mountain, I would guess. Okay. Okay, where do we live off? Okay, 2021. What are the dates of the British Mandate? Okay, now we're going to come up to modern times. Let me go through maybe a couple more of these slides here. Yeah, this is what we want to take a look at right here. Now, the history of Jerusalem through the Middle Ages is very complicated. It changes hands many times. Let me just say here that you have Muslims. You have Muslims from Arabia, you have Muslims from Egypt, you have Muslims from Persia, you have Muslims from Turkey, all controlling Jerusalem at various times. It's changing hands. You also have in the Middle Ages Christian crusaders. Okay, so they come from Western Europe and they're conquering the Muslims, and two periods of time, roughly, let's just give round figures, around 1000 AD. You've got Christian crusaders controlling the area. So it's changing hands between different Muslim groups and also various Christian crusader groups, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Eventually, the Ottomans succeed. They become towards the latter part of the Middle Ages and on into relatively modern times, the ones who are controlling all the way up until World War I. So the Ottomans are in control of this area during World War I. They ally themselves with Germany. And when the Germans lose World War I, the Ottomans also lost, and all that territory came under the control of the League of Nations. League of Nations. So what we're talking about here then, under the British Mandate from 1920 up until 1948, is what happens to Jerusalem and really all of the land of Israel under the British Mandate in the aftermath of World War I. So what did happen to all these areas that had formerly been controlled by the Ottomans, the Turks? Well, the League of Nations divided up most of it between France and Great Britain. Okay, they were, they were the parties that won the war, right? World War I. And so France and Great Britain now are put in charge of various areas, and they're told, you control these areas, you set up some kind of governmental control that's going to allow these areas to flourish and to be healthy and strong. So, for instance, north, up in Lebanon and Syria, the French were in control. In Palestine, and I'm going to use the name Palestine because that's what they called it, the British were in control. The British were also in control down in Egypt and further to the east in what today is the country of Jordan and Iraq. The countries of Jordan, Iraq, modern Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, they were all created by these mandates, the British and French mandates. So these countries are not ancient countries, they're modern countries that were formed in the aftermath of World War I. So when it comes to some of these discussions about Israel, they'll say, oh, well, the Jews came after World War II and they kicked the Arabs out of their ancient homeland. Just bear in mind that almost all of the nations in that part of the world are not much older than Israel. So we're not talking about nationalities, we're talking about, certain people groups. And when it comes to any group of people called Palestinians, there has never been a nation called Palestine. And there was never any ethnic group known as Palestinians. Those are modern constructs that come out of the conflict between Arabs who want to control Palestine and don't want the Jews to have it. They refer to themselves as Palestinians. Back in 1947, when the modern state of Israel was created, the Jewish newspaper published in Jerusalem, that today is called the Jerusalem Post, was at that time called the Palestinian Post. Jews living in Israel referred to themselves as Palestinians. And Arabs living there called themselves Palestinians. And European descendants that were left over from the Crusader era that lived there called themselves Palestinians. It wasn't a national or ethnic denotation. It simply described the area, the geographical area where they lived. That's what Palestinian meant. But today we've kind of got a corruption of terminology when we have an ethnic group, these Arabs who are referring to themselves as, quote, Palestinians, and trying to make a story out of Jews coming and kicking these ancient Palestinians out of their homeland. That's not historically accurate at all. Okay, coming back now to the mandate. The British mandate was created in 1920 by the League of Nations. And at that time, the orange shows Jewish settlements. Now, it's pretty sparse, but look at how many there were. This is before the creation of the modern state of Israel. And at this time, the British now are controlling it. Up until then, it was under the control of the Ottomans. So even under the Ottomans, what you're seeing in the orange, this is where Jews lived during the Ottoman Empire. So the British now are thinking, what shall we do with Palestine? How can we govern this? Well, around this time in England, in fact, really from the 16th century, there was a strong Christian Zionist movement active in Britain. And so there was a lot of British Christian sentiment favorable towards the Jews coming into their ancient homeland. And there was an important man in the British government, Lord Balfour, who delineated the official British position and wrote this in a letter that has come to be known as the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration said, look, we have Palestine. Palestine at that time, by the way, included both sides of the Jordan River. Balfour said the British government recognizes that the Jews should be given a homeland in Palestine. That's basically all it says. It didn't delineate any geographical boundaries, just said that the Jews should have a homeland in Palestine. Now, the British government had a problem on their hands because there were both Jews and Arabs living here. And if they declared a Jewish state, they'd have a big uprising on their hands. So they declared their official position, but then they sat on their hands and didn't do anything about it. Kind of like a little over 20 years ago, the United States Congress declared that Jerusalem is the recognized capital, and they mandated that the President of the United States move the embassy. But they gave him an out. They said, if for causes of national security, you need to postpone that, we give you a window every year. You can sign a waiver to postpone that. So for over 20 years, every U.S. president went against the wishes of Congress and didn't move the embassy. And finally now, our current president authorized the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem. Well, the British back in 1920 said Jews should have a homeland there. That was their official position. The Balfour Declaration states it, but they didn't do anything about it. They just kind of let it sit there and fester. So under page 21, point number 8, the British Mandate 1917 to 1948, at the conclusion of World War I, the League of Nations divided control of most of the Middle Eastern lands between Britain and France. Britain was given a mandate for Palestine, and here's point B. Britain's official position that the Jews should have a homeland in Palestine is contained in numerous documents, most notably the Balfour Declaration. And that is your answer to question number, 21. Okay, what are the dates for the British Mandate? And you can put roughly 1920. We're between 1917 and 1948. That's when the British Mandate is coming in. The official British position of the Jews in relation to Palestine, that's your Balfour Declaration. Number 23, what was the status of Jerusalem according to the UN Partition Plan of 1947? Okay, so what happens? Let's pick up the story where we left off. Britain now is sitting on its hands doing nothing because they just don't want to mess with it. Eventually, World War II erupts. And so down in quote, Palestine, as it was still referred to then, you have a very important and influential ruler among the Arabs. And his name was Faisal Hussein. Faisal Hussein was a close ally of Hitler. In fact, Hitler had a final solution not only for the Jews of Europe, but also for the Jews of the Middle East. And he had an agreement with Hussein that Hussein would carry out the final solution in the Middle East. Hitler and his men would take care of Europe. I just read the other day that in Canada, they have a copy of a book that was written by one of Hitler's men that detailed his plan for taking care of the Jews in North America once they won the war. And there's a copy of that book in Canada today. So thank God they didn't win, because they were not going to stop with Europe. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of the game here. So World War II erupts. And in the aftermath of World War II, what do we do with the world? I mean, you had Germany had conquered Germany's allies among the Arabs. Now they've lost. What are we going to do with all this territory? Well, the League of Nations had become kind of antiquated, and there was a desire to replace it with a new organization called the United Nations. And so the United Nations comes into existence after World War II, and the leftover matters that the League of Nations hadn't taken care of falls into the hands of the United Nations. And one of the first items of business the United Nations deals with was what to do with this British mandate that the British never talked about. Well, unfortunately, the British position was a little bit ambiguous. Balfour Declaration had only said the Jews should have a homeland in Palestine. Did they mean only on one side of the Jordan River? Or did they mean on both sides of the Jordan River? Palestine encompassed both. This was called Cisjordan. This was called Transjordan. So Balfour didn't distinguish between Cisjordan and Transjordan. I would think that a normal reading of that, saying they have a homeland in Palestine, would mean both sides, because that was Palestine. But many were thinking, well, it would just be in Cisjordan. But that still would encompass all of this side. So did Balfour mean part of this side or all of it? Well, nobody knows. There's a big debate over this. But the United Nations comes into existence, and in 1947, they finally voted on a way of dealing with this. They said, look, you've got Jews there, and you've got Arabs there. And so according to the UN partition plan, there was to be a Jewish state in orange, like this, and the yellow part would be given to the Arabs. Jerusalem here, you see in white, was to be an international city under United Nations administration. So that was the UN partition plan. It's called a partition plan because it would partition Cisjordan between the Arabs and the Jews. So the UN voted on it. The UN passed it. And so this offer was made to the Jews and to the Arabs. The Jews said, great, we'll take it. The Arabs said, no way. And so immediately, in 1948, a big war erupted between the Jews and the Arabs. The Jews fought hard. They had very little. They had just barely survived the Second World War. And many of the Jews that came, well, many of the Jews that lived in the land to begin with were impoverished. Some of the Jews that managed to filter in from Europe after the end of World War II had nothing but the clothes on their back. And they were facing well-armed Arab armies from all around. And by what can only be described as a miracle of God, the Jews won. They completely won. In some of the places, like down here in Jaffa, the Arab armies told the people living there, leave your houses, go into safety, we'll push the Jews into the Mediterranean, and then you can have your houses back. Well, instead, the Jews fought hard, and they won this war. Not only did they win their portion, but they won a corridor leading right up to Jerusalem. Now, they didn't take eastern Jerusalem, but eastern Jerusalem was occupied. It was occupied by Jordan. Now, remember, the UN partition plan said Jerusalem would be an international city governed by the United Nations. When you talk about occupied territory in Israel, usually most people are saying portions of like the West Bank occupied by Israel. But don't forget that initially Jordan occupied territory that wasn't given to it by the United Nations either. And so from 1948 until 1967, Jerusalem, or what's called East Jerusalem, was occupied by the Jordanians. Western Jerusalem, over on this side, was held by the Jews. And there was a border between them, barbed wire border and landmines and everything. The situation was pretty tense. But this was the UN partition plan. So what does our question say? It says, what was the status of Jerusalem according to the partition plan? So according to the plan, the status of Jerusalem was an international city governed or controlled or administered by the United Nations. Jews didn't get it, the Arabs didn't get it, the Turks didn't get it, Britain didn't get it. It was to be under UN control. But that all fell apart because the Arabs rejected the partition plan, war erupted. But the plan was for it to be under the control of the United Nations. 24. What was the status of Jerusalem as a result of Israel's war for independence? Okay, status of Jerusalem as a result of the War of Independence. Israel gets West Jerusalem. Jordan is occupying East Jerusalem. That's the answer to question 24. Yeah, I'll say it again. West Jerusalem was conquered by Israel. East Jerusalem was conquered by Jordan. So Jerusalem becomes a divided city as a result of this war for independence, divided between Israel and Jordan. You'll hear today in discussions about Jerusalem the expression, Jerusalem, the undivided capital of Israel. That means united. And we'll go on and we'll talk about when it became united. But as a result of the war of independence in 1948, Jerusalem became divided between eastern and western parts. West Jerusalem with Israel, East Jerusalem with Jordan. So here's what the partition plan looked like, what it should have been. If the Arabs had agreed, said, that's hunky-dory, we'll go with it, then the land would have looked like this. Instead, this map is, well, I'm not going to spend time on this. It's a little bit confusing to try to follow, but these are some of the major military movements that took place during the War for Independence. But here's your corridor leading up to Western Jerusalem right here. This is what Israel fought hard to get. And notice it's surrounded on both sides by Arab territory. But you had the state of Israel, as a result of their war, with all this kind of hashed-in area. Very narrow, very difficult to defend that narrow territory like that. But they had it, and they were glad to have it. Okay, eventually the borders that were controlled from 48 till 67 ended up looking like this. Okay, this area is called the West Bank, right in here. This was controlled by Jordan, including East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, and all of this was West Bank. Syria is up here, all the way up to the Sea of Galilee. This is what's known as the Golan Heights, controlled by Syria. You have Israeli farmers down here in the valley with Syrians firing down on them. And they have, right up to the Sea of Galilee, this is Lebanon up here. But this is all controlled by Jordan, West Bank. But your city of, your country of Israel extends all the way from Eilat. This is all desert down here. They have Beersheba. Here's the Gaza Strip. Okay, here is, this was the Philistines. This was Greek Palestine, or the Philistines. So Israel didn't conquer the Gaza Strip. They had this much extending up and through here. Okay. Then in 1967, the Arabs fought another war against Israel. And Israel fought back, and they fought hard. and by another miracle of God, they won. It's called the 6 Days War. It was fought in 1967, a very short-lived war. But Israel had remarkable success in the 6 Days War. After the 6-Day War, these were the boundaries of Israel. Israel conquered all of the Sinai Peninsula, all the way up to the Suez Canal. In fact, probably the only reason they did not go as far as Cairo, Egypt, was because the United States begged them not to. Okay. So they stopped here. They gained all of the West Bank. They conquered the Golan Heights. They took that from Syria so that the Syrians could no longer use that high ground to fire down the farmers down in the valley down below. And they gained East Jerusalem. And they united Jerusalem as one city. So those borders were not recognized by all nations, but they were declared by Israel. So, question 25, what was the status of Jerusalem as a result of the 6 Days War? The result was a unified Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty. And I just cannot imagine Israel ever giving East Jerusalem away. Just don't think it'll ever happen. A lot of speculation about what President Trump's Mideast peace plan is all about. I mean, he simply hasn't told us yet. But a lot of the speculation has him giving East Jerusalem or some portions of East Jerusalem to the Palestinians for a capital. So, you know, if that's it, I cannot comprehend Israel agreeing to that. And I can't comprehend really the Palestinians agreeing to anything other than the entirety of all of East Jerusalem. So, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Eventually, Israel will enter into a peace agreement with Egypt, where they exchange land for peace. And this Sinai Peninsula is given back to Egypt, pushing the southern boundary of Israel right up here. Syria has always said Israel cannot have the Golan Heights. We want it back. I don't think Israel will ever give it back. They need the Golan Heights for national defense. So they won't give it back to Syria. They conquered it, they have the right to it, and they need it. Now, let's talk about modern day Old City Jerusalem. Okay, East Jerusalem, surrounded by Ottoman era walls. Okay, there are gates to the city of Jerusalem. In ancient times, cities were surrounded by a defensive wall, and they used usually one gate, one way in and out. And that made it easier to defend. Very rarely would you have two gates to a city. Only a very, very large city would have multiple gates. But now we're talking about a medieval wall. There actually are a number of gates. So gate number 1, starting on the eastern side, actually entering into the Temple Mount itself from the Kidron Valley, is the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate today is blocked in. There is no door that can be opened. But the prophets say that in the kingdom, the Messiah will sit in the Golden Gate. Or perhaps King David will sit in the Golden Gate, depending on your interpretation. And the Golden Gate is quite prominent, and you can see it but you can't go through it. Okay, you can see it from both inside and outside, and we will see both of those. A second gate just to the north of that is the Lion Gate, so-called Lion Gate. That's because in the walls above the gate are carved what looked like lions. They're actually probably leopards, not lions, because it was an ancient symbol of the Persian Empire. But the Lion Gate is there, and you can go through the Lion Gate. We'll go through it, and it is on the north side of the Temple Mount. Okay, on this drawing, north is over here on the left, south is over on the right. So east is on the top, and west is on the bottom. So you kind of have to reorient your thinking. But there's the Golden Gate, the Lion Gate. A third gate is over here on the north side called Herod's Gate. Herod's Gate. Then the Damascus Gate. Both Herod's Gate and Damascus Gate are on the north side. The Damascus Gate is the most elaborate of all the gates in this city wall. And it's the gate that you and I will go through if we are either entering from our hotel. If you walk down to the old city from our hotel, you'll come right straight down the street that ends up across from Damascus Gate, and then you can come in. Or if you leave the old city and you're going back to the hotel, you'll go exit through this Damascus Gate. Okay. The new gate is right over here on this corner. This is on the northwest corner, the new gate. And it's one of the smallest gates in the city. On the side, the Jaffa Gate. Okay, so now we're on the west side. So if you think about the geography, Damascus is where? Syria. Where is Syria? North of Israel. So it's in the north end. Jaffa is where? It's on the coast, to the west. So in the west side, you've got a road leading out here heading down towards Jaffa. That's where the Jaffa Gate is. The Jaffa Gate is right next to the Citadel of David that I mentioned. The Citadel of David has a very, very nice museum. On your free day, if you want something really interesting to do, go walk through the museum at the Citadel of David. And you can also start your walk around the walls of the city if you want to walk the old city walls from this location. So this is the Jaffa Gate. Down here around this end is the Zion Gate. Okay, from last week, you remember I talked a little bit about the location of Zion. There's biblical Zion, which is Mount Zion, between the Tyropoeon Valley and the Kidron Valley. But today they call Mount Zion on the Western Hill. That's where the Zion Gate is. It's on the Western Hill. Don't get confused by the name. Don't think that this is the entrance to Mount Zion, biblical Mount Zion. It's the entrance to this region of the Western Hill, the Zion Gate. The Dung Gate, not a very nice sounding name, and how ironic it is that it's the Dung Gate you enter through to go up to the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. But there you have it. The Dung Gate was in ancient times where they took the refuse out of the city to the south, dump it into the valley of Ben Hinnom, Hinnom Valley, Gehenna. So that's why it's called the Dung Gate.
I noticed on another map it called it the Valley Gate. Is that
The Valley Gate,
common?
because, yeah, same gate, because going out to the valley, to the Gehenna Valley.
What do most people call it then?
Dung Gate. Yeah. Yeah, that's the common name. So here are the main gates to the city. Okay, all of these are open with the exception of the Golden Gate. Then there are other gates. If you talk about the Temple Mount itself, there are various gates leading into the Temple Mount. The only one that we can enter through is called the Mughrabi Gate from the Western Wall. There are other gates that Muslims can use to enter, but only Muslims. Those are the gates of the city. Okay, any questions? Okay. So here's this picture again showing the Kidron Valley, Tyropoeon Valley, Valley of Hinnom. Green, these are the Ottoman walls. The white walls are biblical walls of the city. In Solomon's time, an artist's depiction of Jerusalem looks like this. This is probably fairly close to what it would have looked like if you were standing on the Mount of Olives in Solomon's day looking at it. So here you see the main gate entering from the east, and Gihon Spring is right here, the water source. Siloam Pool would be down in this region. Now Solomon did not have Siloam Pool. That was by the time of Hezekiah. Solomon actually used Gihon Spring and directed it through channels this way, and then through holes in the base here, had water coming out here watering these gardens. These were Solomon's gardens. But he had tremendous things going on. But the city walls, you can see, it's just a narrow city, long going up Mount Zion. Here's the palace, the king's palace, where Carnegie wants to put the temple. Okay, Gihon Spring, right down here, right here. But you can't have the palace in the same location as the temple. Temple further up, at the top of the city, of the hill, where you have a nice location for a threshing floor. So there would have been retaining walls around this. Of course, this is in Solomon's day. Later on, those retaining walls are built up and expanded. These are probably some administrative buildings, they think. So, Solomon's temple. To its left is the royal palace. So the temple, to its left, the royal palace. Royal palace, and the citadel. Okay, oh, here's the number. 1, 2, 3. Number 4, that may, a stepstone structure that may well have supported a large public building. Right down in here, this region, today, this is quite visible. Here it just looks like it's rocky, but it's actually stones built up upon stones in a stepped structure. And they think that is actually from the Jebusite era, from the Canaanites. So it's still standing there, pre-Davidic structure right up in here. We'll see that when we're there. Gihon Spring, number 5, right down here. Okay, a shaft, number 6, now called Warren's Shaft. The water ran into a conduit called the Siloam Channel. So here's a shaft going up called Warren's Shaft. It used to be thought that this is how David's men got access to the city. But since this has been, this comes out of Biblical Archaeology Review magazine. Here it is, Biblical Archaeology Review, November, December 1985. Since then, extensive archaeological work has been done here around Gihon Spring. And what has been discovered is a vast, a large monumental stairway leading up into the city. They didn't know about before. And so David's men probably did not climb up Warren's Shaft, but fought their way up that big stairway into the city. That's the current thinking. Okay, water ran into a conduit called Siloam Channel, okay, along here, carried water south along the eastern flank of the hill to a storage pool, 8, at the southern end of the city. Windows, 9, in the channel let water out for irrigation. That's here, that's these water coming out along through here. So in biblical time of Solomon, the archaeologists trying to piece together as best they can based on the data they have. They think it looked something very much like this. Okay, So we've got about a half an hour to talk about Bethlehem and Masada. So not nearly as much as we have about Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is that's the big main city. Okay, but we are interested in Bethlehem, aren't we? Bethlehem, the birth of our Savior. Bet-lechem in Hebrew, meaning the house of bread, Bet-lechem. And here in Bethlehem, we find the Church of the Nativity. This is what it looks like on the outside. Doesn't look like much. Inside, it's quite ornate. Here are some review questions. Question 26, what was the earlier name for Bethlehem? 27, to what tribe was Bethlehem allotted? 28, where does the Old Testament prophecy that Christ will be born in Bethlehem? 29, what is Emperor Hadrian known for in connection with Bethlehem? We talked about Hadrian earlier. He was the one who renamed Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina. So what does he have to do with Bethlehem? We'll find out. What is Jerome known for in connection with Bethlehem? Okay, who knows who Jerome was? Good, he translated the Latin Vulgate. Okay, he has a connection with Bethlehem. And then 31, what is the Church of Nativity, or when was the Church of Nativity first built? 32, who built the present church? So those are our review questions for Bethlehem. And so for now, we are going to page 23 in your notes. Notice it says Bethlehem, Hebrew for house of bread, Bethlehem, known also as Bethlehem of Judah or Bethlehem Ephrata. Okay, those are all names for this city. Located, notice, about 5.5 miles south of Jerusalem. Okay, so it's just close by. A second town of Israel was also named Bethlehem in Zebulunite territory, about 7 miles northwest of Nazareth, considerably to the north. This is why this Bethlehem is sometimes designated Bethlehem Ephrata, as opposed to the other Bethlehem. So the earlier name, according to Genesis 35:19, was Ephrat. Ephrat. So Bethlehem Ephrata says this is the Bethlehem where Ephrat used to be, as opposed to Zebulunite Bethlehem. Okay, here was the burial place of Rachel. And this city, according to 1 Chronicles 4:4, was given to the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah. So Jerusalem, just to its north, actually lay right on the boundary between Judah and Benjamin. So from really everything south of Jerusalem is the tribe of Judah, including Bethlehem. This is why it's important that Jesus Christ was born there. He's the King of Israel. The King of Israel, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. So he must come from a Judahite family, and he should be born in Judah. So even though Mary and Joseph are living up in Nazareth, far to the north, nowhere near the tribe of Judah's territory, what happens? Well, a sovereign and supernatural and almighty God arranges for the Romans to prepare this census, requiring everybody to go to their ancient homeland. So both Joseph and Mary, who are tied to Judah, have to go to Bethlehem. And so it happens. There's several other people that are known for Bethlehem. Notice Micah's Levite in Judges 17. The Levite's concubine in Judges 19. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz are all found in Bethlehem. Then David, King David, of course, is from Bethlehem. Joab, Abishai, and Asahel are all from Bethlehem. And Elhanan, one of David's mighty men, was from Bethlehem. David was anointed in Bethlehem by Samuel. David longed for water from the well of Bethlehem. Remember when his mighty men went and brought water to him in the midst of the battle. And he said, "Boy, they risked their lives for this. I'm not going to drink this. This belongs to God." And he poured it out as an offering to the Lord. Bethlehem was fortified by King Rehoboam. It was rebuilt after the return from Babylon. But notice this is an answer to one of the questions. Number 10, Bethlehem was prophesied as the birthplace for the Messiah in Micah 5, verse 2, which specifically says, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth one who is to be king in Israel." So that was fulfilled, of course, again, as we said, by this decree from Caesar Augustus. And as we know, it was the birthplace of Christ, Matthew 2, Luke 2. We know about the slaughter of the babies by Herod the Great. Herod was a madman. He was an egomaniac. He was a control freak, and he wanted power. And so when the wise men showed up and said, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews?" Herod said, "Wait a minute, what do you mean King of the Jews? I'm the King of the Jews. I went to Rome and I got that title for myself. Somebody else is claiming that, huh? Well, we'll just take care of that." So he tells the wise men, "You go worship him, and when you find out where he is, you come back and you tell me so I can go worship him too." Yeah, his worship was in the form of a sacrifice. That's what he wanted. Okay, now we have a question about Hadrian. Hadrian was the 2nd century emperor that insulted the Jews by renaming Jerusalem, by renaming Judea, and by expelling the Jews from Judea. And so this is what he did with reference to Bethlehem. Bethlehem is in Judea. And point number 13, all of the Jews were expelled in the 2nd century from Bethlehem. So it had previously been a Jewish town. But Hadrian said, "Get out of Dodge." AD 405, Jerome, the author of the Latin Vulgate. Jerome finished his translation of the Latin Vulgate in Bethlehem after 20 years of toil. So Jerome spent 20 years translating. It was a lifelong project of his, really. And he traveled around from place to place. But he finished the project in Bethlehem. And I have a picture of Jerome's grotto under the Church of the Nativity here on one of these slides. I want to take you through some of these slides. What you're looking at here is the Church of the Nativity. Oh, let's turn the page just for a moment. On page 24, the Church of the Nativity. See it there at the top? And let me just make a couple of points about this first. The Byzantine Church, from the Byzantines are Christianized Romans, okay, beginning in the 4th century. The Byzantine Church was built here in 325. So this was built over the site that traditionally was the birth of Christ. Now, you can always raise the question, is that authentic? 325, that's, almost 300 years after the birth of Christ, more than 300 years after the birth of Christ. So is that where he really was born? And we simply don't know for sure. But most people are reasonably confident that this is associated with the actual place where Jesus was born, okay? But the first church wasn't built till 325. And then it was destroyed and was rebuilt by Justinian in the 6th century. It'd be the 500s. So when you visit the Church of the Nativity today, which we will, you'll see parts, most of it, from the Justinian church. But there are below the floor mosaic tiles that are preserved from the original Byzantine church. So two phases to the church. Now, let's take a look at some of these. Let me back up. Notice the little tiny door. See it? That's the doorway. And you see these people. Now you can tell the original door was much bigger. Let's take a little closer look at it. Bigger doorway, walled in, small tiny door. Why is this? The door size was reduced so that nobody could enter on horseback. and conquer it. But the story develops when you go in, you have to stoop down. In other words, you must humble yourself to enter into this church. So that's often how it's explained to people today. So the sealed arched doorways from the medieval period. The low open doorway dates from the middle of the second millennium during the Turkish period, purposely made low to prevent thieves and others from entering the church by horseback or with carts. So this is the way we will enter into the Church of the Nativity. Inside, it's gorgeous. And you see on the floor here, these floor tiles dug up. This is where you can look down and see the floor tiles from the Byzantine church. These columns and all this stuff up here and these lights and everything, this is all from the Justinian era church. Here are some of those original floor tiles. Under the present floor, beautiful mosaics from the earlier church, built at the direction of Constantine's mother. The original church was octagonal shaped. Last time we were there, somebody, what
That was Tom, dropped his notebook down.
he dropped his notebook, that was it.
And Tom
Yeah.
had to
Yeah,
tell another nine.
yeah,
Our guy had to jump down and get it.
yeah, he had everybody stand around so nobody could see while he jumped down and grabbed the notebook.
How far down is it from that floor?
Oh, it's not, it's like 3 or 4 feet.
Yeah. But you're not supposed to be down.
No, nobody's supposed to go down. In the Church of the Nativity, this is right above the spot where traditionally Christ was born. There's a 14-point star here. Now you might be wondering, why 14 points? Well, in Matthew, you have the genealogy of Jesus given, and there are 3 divisions of 14 generations, 14, 14, and 14. And so because of that, this 14-point star was placed over it. But the star only comes from the year 1717. So it's, that's just yesterday practically. And it marks the traditional site. Now below is a cave, and you can go into the cave. Not a problem. You go down a stairway, you can see it, and then you can come back up. But this is the easier spot to get to, and so it's, for what it's worth, that's it. There's a closer look at that star. And then the hole, you can look down through that hole and you see down into the cave. Now, just over a little ways down underneath the church, here is where Jerome finished his translation of the New Testament, or the translation of the Bible, not just the New Testament. And I always especially like to take my Greek students down here, because Jerome was a Bible translator. And when he translated the Latin Vulgate, he was translating the New Testament out of the Greek into the Latin. He does this in the 4th century. Why? Because at this time, the Roman Empire is going through a shift, a change. They're adapting more and more the Latin language, and it's the common language of the people. So Latin's, or Jerome's translation was called Vulgate, which means the common. The common. It was the common language of the people. One of the great ironies about church history is that in the Middle Ages, in Europe, the Roman Catholic Church had adopted the Latin Vulgate as the official Bible, but people were no longer speaking Latin. In Western Europe, you've got all kinds of, other languages being spoken, and the Catholics said nobody can translate the Bible into the common language of the people. But their Bible is called the Vulgate, called the Common Language Bible. So I think that's so ironic. Jerome's desire was that people could read the Bible in their own language. And then the Catholics used his Bible to keep people from reading the Bible in their own language. And it was not until then, you have Wycliffe, but really William Tyndale, who makes the Bible available to people. Before him, of course, Martin Luther provides a German language translation, and that really is what starts off Bible translations in more modern times. But back in the 4th century, we can think about Jerome laboring for 20 years to produce the Bible, a modern language Bible for people to read in their own language. And he finishes it right here in this room. So hopefully we'll have time to go there. Outside of Bethlehem, we can visit the shepherds' fields. Of course, when Christ was born, the angel appeared to the shepherds. Which fields exactly, we don't know. But we can see shepherds' fields. We can see the kind of place where they were. And we can imagine what these shepherds were doing. Here's a shepherd right now with his flock inside a rough rock wall. And he's sitting right here in the doorway. He is the door of the sheep. And as he sits in that doorway or lies down to sleep in it, he's protecting the sheep, he's guarding them. They go in or they out through the shepherd. Okay. Then I want to move on to talk about Masada. Any questions about Bethlehem? We cover all the questions? Yeah. Yep. Let's talk about Masada. Masada is one of the well-known sites in Israel because the Jews in the first revolt against Rome made a final last stand against the Romans there. And it's been written about. There's been several movies made about this. We're looking now at a picture of Masada. Notice it is a kind of a trapezoidal-shaped flat mesa. Masada is down in the wilderness of Judea, down by the Dead Sea. And because of the way it is surrounded on all four sides by deep valleys, it was a defensible spot. If you held the high ground on Masada, as long as you had food and water, you could hold out forever. Nobody could ever take it. But the Romans eventually did. And here on the sort of the northwest side, you see this ramp. This is not natural. This was built by the Romans. So the Jewish defenders were up here. The Romans came and laid siege to it. They built a wall around it. Here's one of the Roman encampments. Down here you can still see in this aerial photograph. And there are a number of them around here. They laid siege to it. They thought, well, we'll starve them out or we'll take away their water supply. But Herod the Great had built up a magnificent defensible place here with hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water storage and with stores of food and with plots of land that you could actually farm and grow food on up there. And so what the Romans maybe didn't realize at first was they would never be able to just lay siege to it and starve these people out. So eventually they realized they would have to do something else. And they built that ramp, and they were able to use a battering ram to break down the wall, and they came through. So it's an interesting story. I want to take a look at these review questions, and we'll see if we can answer these in the next 15 minutes. What is a possible Old Testament reference to Masada? 34, who built a fortress on Masada and when? I was just talking about Herod the Great, but that's not the answer to this one. We'll see what that is. 35, who expanded the building of Masada? That's going to be Herod the Great. 36, who used Masada as a base for raiding and harassing the Romans during the Jewish rebellion against Rome? 37, when did the Romans finally breach the wall of Masada? And who was the commander of these Roman forces? 38, what's the elevation? Oh, then we get to the Dead Sea. Okay, we've got a couple more things to do here. But we want to talk about Masada, and on the bottom of page 24 of your notebook, Masada, or in Hebrew, Mitzada. Mitzada. And the name Mitzada simply means fortress in Hebrew. And that's why it has that name. It's located near the southwest shore of the Dead Sea, on top of an isolated rock cliff, as we can see from the picture. Geographical features. The cliffs on the eastern edge of Masada are about 1,475 feet high at 132 feet above sea level, dropping off to the Dead Sea, and the cliffs on the west are about 330 feet high. The natural approaches to the cliff top are very difficult. The top of the plateau is flat and rhomboid shaped, about 1/3 of a mile by 1/6 of a mile. That gives you just an idea of the size of this thing that we're looking at. And there is a wall also built all the way around these kind of roughly 4 sides for defensive purposes. One of the things you can't make out too clearly on this picture, I think I have a better picture of it, but right here, it looks like it steps down and it steps down again, and it does. So there's a palace, actually, that King Herod built down here. The winds come from the north. This is the north end. And it's very hot down here by the Dead Sea. But Herod built this palace to pick up those cool winds that would blow down from the north. And we'll be able to see that when we're up on Masada. Here's a plan of Herod's fortress at Masada. Here's the north end here, where these different steps go down. Up on top of Masada, look at all these different things that are here. Here's one pool for water. There's another cistern here for holding water. Here are various, here's another big pool, Mikvah. Right up in here in this circle, here's where the Romans breached the wall. And there was built right at this location also a synagogue. It's one of the only synagogues we know of that was not oriented towards Jerusalem. Why that is, we don't know. But here are possibly some barracks. There's a Byzantine structure here. Here are storerooms up here. Here's a Byzantine cave dwelling, dwelling houses for members of the royal family. All kinds of stuff built up there. And it's an amazing feat because it was not easy to get up on top of Masada, and all this building material had to be carried up there. The water for these cisterns and pools all had to be carted up there and dumped into these pools. It's just incredible. Here's some of the storehouses, what's left of them. Here's a picture of the synagogue right next to where the Romans breached the wall. But you can see the original seating here, some pillars, what's left of them, and a bit of the walls. Here's inside the synagogue. Here is Herod's bathhouse. This was a place where you could go in basically kind of like a sauna. You see these tiles on the wall with the holes in the side? They would dump water down these tiles. Here, there's a floor built on these pillars, and there would be heat down in here. So water coming down then would turn into steam, and then would ascend back up through these tiles and come out through these holes, and so you could have a steam bath up on top of Masada, of all things. This is the kind of a builder that Herod was. Okay, let's take a look at some of these points in the book. Look on page 25, point number 3. This may have been the stronghold of David, referred to a number of times. 1 Samuel 22, 4 and 5, 23, 14, 24, 22. Now, may have been. We don't know that for sure. But it's very possible when David speaks about this stronghold. Think of how many times David refers to the Lord in the book of Psalms as my rock. Why does David refer to God as his rock? Well, the word rock can refer to a high cliff like Masada, or like some of the cliffs that we see here, because a rock like that is a high place that you can defend. And what is God? He is our defense. He is our defense. And it's possible that in these locations here in 1 Samuel, the stronghold of David was on Masada. If it wasn't Masada, it was probably one of these other high cliffs. Point number 4, Jonathan Maccabee was the one who first built a fortress there that we know of. So this is, again, intertestamental, Maccabees overthrowing the Seleucids, reclaiming Jerusalem and sanctifying the temple. He's the one who also down here to the south first builds a fortress on Masada. We don't have any archaeological remains of this, but we have written testimony that he did build one. The earliest really archaeological remains up on Masada come from Herod the Great. And he is the one who has all this building up there. So he built up Masada between 37 and 31 BC as a refuge for himself, lest his Jewish subjects should rise up against him. To our knowledge, we do not know of Herod ever actually visiting Masada. He may have, but we don't know that for sure. He had it built, and he never had to use it. Now, in 66, this is just before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, okay? 66, first Jewish revolt against Rome. At the beginning of the Jewish uprising against the Romans, a group of Jewish rebels called the Sicarii. These are the dagger men. They took Masada from the Roman garrison stationed there, and they used this then as a base from which they would go down into various areas and engage either in warfare against the Romans, or the other thing they were known for, and the reason they were called the Sicarii, the dagger men, they wanted to make sure that all the Jews were faithful to their uprising. There were some Jews, of course, that were sympathetic towards the Romans. And the Sicarii would go up to a Roman sympathizer in a crowded place, very secretly, quietly pull his dagger out from his cloak and stab the Jew, put his dagger away, and disappear into the crowds. So that's why they were called the Sicarii. We don't find this name Sicarii in the New Testament, with one possible exception. So we read of a man whose name is Judas, what? Iscariot. And there's a lot of debate about what the name Iscariot means. And we don't know with 100% certainty, but one theory is that Iscariot is from Ish, which means man, Ish Sicari. Ish Sicari sounds like Iscariot. When you change the Hebrew or Aramaic Ish Sicari into Greek, it comes off as Iscariot. So it's possible that Judas was the son of a Sicarii, a Sicarii man. Some people say, well, the Sicarii we know of came later than Judas, so how could you have a Sicarii back in Judas's day? Well, maybe they were already in existence at this time. It wasn't very much earlier that you have Judas, and then from the Sicarii. But that's one possible linkage. Okay. Number 7, in AD 70, they were joined by additional Sicarii and their families who were expelled from Jerusalem and were living there shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem. For the next 2 years, they used Masada as their base for raiding and harassing Roman and Jewish settlements alike. Okay, drop down to number 9. In the spring of the year 73, after approximately 2 to 3 months of siege, the Roman forces finally breached the walls of the fortress with a battering ram. So the Jews had been shut up in Masada, trying to defend themselves from the Romans. The eve of the entrance of the Romans, the Jews all met together, and in a very moving speech, their leader urged them not to become slaves of Rome. They knew that if they were to give themselves up to Rome, their women would be raped, children would become slaves, the men would be murdered. They said we would be better off dying as free men than to become slaves of the Romans. And they committed mass murder. So the men elected who would be chosen to put the others to death. And then they drew straws as to who would kill each other. Josephus tells us that there were 2 women and a group of children that hid themselves. And when the Romans broke in, everybody was dead except for these 2 women and a few children. And they came out to tell the story. And so it was kind of like taking the wind out of the sails of the Romans. They thought, we finally have defeated these people, and they were looking for this grand victory, and it was just an empty place with a bunch of dead people already. So that's the story of Masada. There's a list of things to see. I'll let you read that on your own. I just want to finish up with a few notes about En-Gedi. There's nothing on the quiz about it, but En-Gedi is further up north from Masada on the side of the sea, the Dead Sea. And En-Gedi is a spring. The name means Ain spring, Gedi of the goat kid. And there are goats, ibex goats, that live in the hillsides here. But on the way up to En-Gedi, there is a canyon with caves in the side of it. And you remember reading in your Bible about when David was fleeing before Saul. Saul was seeking David's life. And it tells about David hiding out in this cave at En-Gedi. And Saul goes in to relieve himself, and David comes up secretly, cuts off the edge of his cloak. And then later on, David calls out to Saul and says, you know, see, here I had the opportunity to take your life. You can see how loyal I am to you because I've got your part of your cloak, and I didn't take your life. That happened on the way up to En-Gedi. And this is a region, this looks very similar to Masada, doesn't it? These flat plateaus with canyons going up along the sides. But up in this canyon is the spring of En-Gedi, and it comes cascading down the side of the mountain from beautiful waterfalls and pools of water. Here is one such waterfall. We'll hike up to this waterfall, and it's just gorgeous. This is only about a 20-minute walk to get up to this waterfall. Very easy hike. Here are some of the goat kids, the ibex goats that live up there. You see their coloration blends in with the rock walls, and they're very, very difficult to spot. Sometimes you can be looking right at one, you don't see it until it moves its head or it wiggles a little bit. We don't go up on top because it's too far of a hike, but there is up on top of En-Gedi a Chalcolithic temple from very, very early times. I would guess probably shortly after the flood of Noah. Early settlers built this temple up here. And then we get into the Dead Sea. We're going to have to stop here. We're out of time. And next week we'll pick up here and we'll have some more to say. Again, if you have any questions about the trip itself, we can start out with a discussion about that. If you had any questions come into your mind about packing, about traveling, about the usage of electricity, about what kind of food we eat, bring those questions because we want to make sure you have all those answered. So we'll stop at this time, and I wish you a good night and a good weekend, and we look forward to seeing you next week.